We're so pleased to have Leah Shepard-Carey here. She's one of the CARLA Fellows this year, and she's going to be presenting on one of the studies for her dissertation. And the title of her talk today is Sustaining and Fostering Multilingualism in English Medium Elementary Classrooms, a collaborative exploration of translanguaging literacy pedagogies. So please welcome.
Thank you. Okay, so again, I'm Leah, and today what I'm going to talk about are preliminary findings from my dissertation. So I'm still in the process of analyzing and collecting my data. And so today I'm talking about a case study from year one of this work. It's really important to connect my own background with this work because that's kind of how I got into it. And so I have background as an elementary and ESL bilingual pre-K teacher. I've had a lot of my teaching experience with the Somali, life, and refugee communities. And I've done most of my dissertation work in the school I taught in, so I have a long-standing relationship with my former school community and the teachers and the teacher in my study, Ms. Hassan. And so my prior personal research, my questions for my dissertation really come out of my prior personal research that shows discrepancies in how our reading instruction with emergent bilinguals and how we can support the potential of their communicative repertoires. And so my dissertation on a larger scale is a collaborative exploration of translanguaging literacy pedagogies. So we know that we have over 4.8 emergent multilinguals in our public schools and many more students who are actually multilingual and not classified as English language learners. And we've had state and federal legislation that has called for instructional and assessment practices that leverage students' multilingualism. And so here in Minnesota, it's the LEAPS Act. On a federal level, it's Every Student Succeeds Act. But our programming design curriculum, and I'm talking about English learners in English medium contexts, have not really been implementing curriculum and standards to support these learners' multilingual repertoires. And so in line with culturally sustaining pedagogies, schools have an urgent need to value the multi-ethnic and multilingual present and future of our society. And really what I take that to mean is to also integrate students' multilingual repertoires in schools. And so my interest has been in multilingualism and literacy learning, and so we know that bilinguals transfer cognitive and conceptual knowledge across languages. We have various studies on translanguaging and multilingual literacy approaches surrounding translation, multimodal and multilingual composing, multilingual peer discussion that shows us that these pedagogies are beneficial for both identity development and academic development. But one of my big questions across my PhD and my graduate work is, what knowledge are we missing out on with English learners when we don't draw upon their communicative repertoires? And so translanguaging pedagogies have been positioned as one way to kind of approach this issue. And so translanguaging pedagogies are intentional approaches for integrating students' multilingualism into the classroom. It really starts with the children and their communicative repertoires and their cultures. And translanguaging pedagogies derive from dynamic and critical perspectives of multilingualism. And I'm not going to go into depth about all this epistemological and theoretical history with translanguaging, but when I talk about a translanguaging practice, I recognize that translanguaging practices are practices in which multilinguals are strategically drawing on their communicative repertoires. However, I have, I think, some healthy skepticism with translanguaging pedagogies, especially because a lot of my work has been done with learners from less common language backgrounds. And so more recently, other scholars have begun to talk about this and say that, you know, translanguaging pedagogies may not achieve their full potential and emancipatory aims without adequate bilingual materials, policies, and programming, and same language peers and teachers. And so especially a lot of the translanguaging literature has focused on older students, or at least students above early childhood. There also tends to be this focus on positive results and products in the translanguaging literature. And few studies actually elucidate the collaborative processes of developing and implementing translanguaging pedagogies. So I won't be able to answer all of these questions today, but these are the gaps that I'm seeing in this literature. And so because of my relationship with the context and my relationship with Ms. Hassan, this study I'm sharing today is really just asking like what's happening here when we intentionally implement these designs. And so I'm asking what teacher and researcher translanguaging stances, plans and reflections surrounding designs and translanguaging practices emerged throughout our first year of implementing translanguaging strategies during literacy learning. And so I'm drawing on Garcia and colleagues' framework of stance, design, shift. And so again, translanguaging pedagogies are intentional approaches for including students' multilingualism in the classroom. And so this framework asserts that teachers need to take up specific beliefs about students' multilingualism in that it's integral to their identity. Teachers need to take up intentional designs that draw on students' multilingualism. And they also need to respond to students' language practices moment to moment. And so that said, well, we have translanguaging pedagogies. Because I intentionally implemented these with the teacher, I don't think we can divorce intentional translanguaging pedagogical designs from like the spontaneous translanguaging practices that are happening in the classroom. So I acknowledge that a lot of Ms. Hassan's and my spontaneous translanguaging practices come because of these intentional designs as well, and you'll see that in the data. And so again, this study is a qualitative case study of year one within a larger participatory design research project across 2 school years. And this year's data that I'm talking about is 2018 and 2019 data. And so this took place in a 2nd grade classroom in a large Midwestern city. The teacher, Ms. Hassan, is a multilingual Somali woman. She's an advocate, a liaison, very active community member. We also had a culturally and linguistically diverse class of 30, which adds another layer on to be able to do this, because that's hello? Oh, there. Which adds another layer on to the feasibility between doing this. And so most of her emergent bilinguals were from Somali and East African contexts. Otherwise, she had a lot of Latinx students, African American students, and students of European descent. So we did both whole group and small group reading lessons and planning together, but this case study focuses on small group reading context because it was the most consistent and frequent use of translanguaging pedagogies. And so we did about 1 book, guided reading book per week, and it aligned with the curriculum standards and materials because she was in a district that had some restrictive boundaries on what materials we used and what we did. You'll also see in the data that there are 3 students, Hamdi, Mustafa, and Ahmed. They are my focal students for this case study, and they are multilinguals. Their first language is Somali, and they also are learning English and Arabic in their religious school. They were reading at a 1st grade level, and they were averagely 3s as WIDA levels, which means they were intermediate language learners, but they had tended to have higher speaking scores. With their reading, they had a few issues with decoding, which is to be expected because they were 2nd graders, but generally they needed the most support with comprehension and vocabulary. And so with the design of this, I think it's because I'm stepping on this, so I'm going to move. That's probably it. Let me know if I'm in the way. But anyways, so with our design, drawing on design-based research, we engaged in iterative design cycles. We set some goals at the beginning of the year, and then after a few cycles, we would evaluate what we were doing, and that took the form of semi-structured interviews with her and I, and we did these evaluations twice a year. The intentional pedagogical designs we engaged in and designed around were bilingual vocabulary support in L1 and L2. And it should be noted that we weren't doing a lot of writing in students' first language just because, 1, they were learning how to write and read for the first time, and 2, they had very much emerging literacies in their first languages. We also decided that building background about books and concepts in their first language and second language were important, and then explaining and working on reading comprehension strategies in 2 languages. And so oftentimes this would take the form of like vocabulary cards, sentence stems with pictures, graphic organizers, etc. And so it really changed. We had the same strategies we focused on, but these changed obviously because of the books we were reading and the units. And so during this school year, I visited the classroom 2 to 3 times a week during literacy block, and we co-designed and co-taught whole group and small group lessons. We engaged in bi-weekly planning sessions. And so the data here are small group lessons, and for this case study, it's 10 lessons that are representative of the work we did across the school year, related planning sessions to these small group lessons, and then structured reflective interviews, so our evaluation of what was happening in the context, and then lesson plans, field notes, and other artifacts. Again, I'm still engaging in this analysis. I've probably analyzed about 85 to 90% of the data, but need to go through and do some verification and whatnot. And so Ms. Hassan is actually helping me transcribe and translate this work. So I'm very lucky to have that. But we've been co-transcribing and co-translating and working together through bilingual instructional moments. And this involves member checking and talking about the data during these meetings. And then I've been doing some qualitative thematic coding of stances, designs, and practices. And so I'm just going to show you a snapshot of some of my findings across this framework. And so when I talk about stances, designs, and shifts, I actually changed it to practices because I don't know what Ms. Hassan is thinking and why she's shifting to meet students' needs. So these are my interpretations of the translanguaging practices. And these really tend to overlap, which is not surprising, but you'll see some of the same themes across my findings. And so for my first question, I wanted to know what stances do we take up, because this is collaborative work, but you'll see most of Ms. Hassan's data because you can talk to me directly if you have any questions. But stance, I was wondering, what do Ms. Hassan and Leah communicate about their approaches and ideologies surrounding multilingualism and multilingual pedagogies? So the biggest themes that arised, which were not so surprising to me, were that we were both affirming students' multilingualism, their identity, their multiculturalism. We talked a lot about the academic and career benefits of multilingualism, and then we also talked about how students and us need to be co-learners when we're engaging across students' languages. And so often Ms. Hassan would say, I think we need to make the classroom a safe zone or a multilingual zone for students, that they can use their home language here in school. A more poignant thing she said was that I think the goal is to let them know that it is very important to keep their identity. Without your identity, you're nothing. And so she said things that were like this quite a bit throughout our study. And again, going back to setting the tone in the classroom, whatever language you have is welcome, and it's okay to speak your language. It's okay to speak to your friends in your own language, as long as it stays academic, and social is fine too. So she also talked about a little bit between the social and academic dichotomy, which I won't get into today, but she definitely separated the two throughout our study. We also talked a lot about the academic and career benefits of multilingualism, and I've had some tensions with that myself, but I also acknowledge that Ms. Hassan is an immigrant woman who has her own background, and so frequently she would say, it's going to help you to use your first language. You'll be smarter than your friends. And then she also, when we were talking about other teachers taking up these strategies, she was kind of embodying what she would say to them, and she said, hey, I know you're teaching, but this is by including multilingualism in your class, your children are actually going to strive academically. And then she said several times, if you speak 2 languages or you use your multilingualism, you'll get more money. And she, to quote her verbatim, she said, you'll be able to get a nice government job. She says, I tell my kids that all the time, if you speak your language. And so that was also real with her stances. Something that hasn't shown up as much in the literature, but is not surprising about taking kind of these translanguaging stances, is that we need to be co-learners with our students. So I don't speak Somali. The kids have varying proficiencies in their linguistic repertoires. And we experience some resistance as well. And so we talked a lot about needing to learn with our students, or needing to make an environment of co-learning. And so I said, and it doesn't matter if you feel like you know all the words or everything. Mrs. Ham responded in our discussion, it's okay, nobody is punishing you for it, we're just learning together. So we're embodying kind of what we would say to students. Ms. Hassan also mentioned me learning Somali, and so she said, oh, if Miss Carey is trying to learn my language, why am I losing it? Again, embodying the students. And then in talking about giving advice to other teachers, she said, I think we teachers have to be willing to put ourselves out there. If you don't put yourselves out there, meaning like learning with the students, how do you expect children to use their own language in the classroom? And so those stances are great, but I also want to know about like how are these stances in tension with or aligning with what we're doing in the classroom. And so in our planning and reflection surrounding designs, I wanted to know, so what do we communicate about our design and implementation processes, and what needs and challenges become salient? And so largely, we noticed that we needed to build a multilingual and multicultural ecology, encourage students' first languages more because there was a bit of resistance. We talked a lot about the lack of materials in Somali for students and the need for models of multilingualism in the classroom. But funnily enough, even though I like going into this coding, I was like, oh my God, the kids were so resistant to using their first language. We did talk quite a bit about a general willingness to use their first language. And so I'm going to go through this fast, but generally we just said you talked about encouraging students to keep their home language, and we both at different points said if we were to redo this or next year, we would do this and this and this. But Ms. Hassan also recognized that this multilingual ecology didn't only need to happen on a classroom level, but it needed to happen on a broader level, and she recognized systemic constraints. So she said, give them, referring to emergent bilinguals, something that relates to them, and they would be very successful. If the system only serves certain people, they're well off. English is their first language. So frequently, Ms. Hassan would refer to the system, schools not serving her English learners or her children of color as well. And then we talked a lot about, again, the materials and having models. There were times where we talked positively where like having sentence strips and bilingual materials helped the students. But Ms. Hassan and I really talked about the materials not being present, or multilingual materials not being present in our environment. And so she asked, you know, if the materials, materials you have are not matching the students you're teaching, how do you want those students to be successful? That's the million-dollar question. We also talked quite a bit about students' resistance. So you'll be able to see in some of the snippets of the transcripts I'm going to show you, the students aren't doing a lot of the talking actually, which merits analysis in various ways. But Ms. Hassan thought that this meant, you know, I feel ashamed that they're ashamed of speaking their language and they don't realize how lucky they are. And then in reflecting on our year, she said, I think the kids had a challenge. I mean, they gave you, to me, the cold shoulder, you could tell. And I said, they did. They're like, why are we doing this? They said that so many times to me. Why are we doing this? And I would ask them for a word in Somali, that's me. And you know, you would be away. Ms. Hassan would often go do things with other kids in the classroom, and they would be like, I don't know, ask Ms. Hassan. And so they often put Somali expertise on Ms. Hassan too, which was pretty interesting. And just generally, like students throughout the year started showing more interest in using their first language. Hamdi, the little second grade girl, started asking me, you know, when are we going to use Somali? When are we going to talk? Because I think she started to recognize that when I came, we were going to probably more intentionally use Somali, which I don't doubt. And Ms. Hassan mentioned that I pushed her to use students' home languages. The students would start being willing to correct me. They were excited to sound out words and learn words in Somali, even if they don't know them. We had these vocabulary sheets, and they were very excited about interacting with them. They would volunteer to help or translate things for me, and they just generally engaged in more willingness to try. But again, the stances are important, our own personal reflections are important, but like what's actually happening in the classroom is also very interesting to me too. So I asked what translanguaging practices emerged during small group literacy learning. And if you, again, I'm not finished analyzing, but if you see here, I separated the data by Ms. Hassan's translanguaging practices and my translanguaging practices, just because I'm not a multilingual in Somali. And so it wouldn't be appropriate to kind of mix those two together. And then also the students' translanguaging practices. And you can see here, and I'll show you and talk about it, that most of the time the teachers and the students were translating. This often happened at the word level. There were a lot of times where Ms. Hassan would request information or a translation. Similarly, I would request translation or prompt students' first language use. Ms. Hassan, because she did speak the first language of the students, could support them in their first language by explaining things. And then I would prompt or acknowledge students' expertise in their first language as well. But you can see the discrepancy even in the codes here. The students would often give me one-word translations. There were very few times where they engaged in extended discourse in their first language, despite me trying to use it, despite Ms. Hassan trying to use it. And that wasn't necessarily the point of the study, but it was jarring to see the difference in how students use the language. And so I'm just going to show you a few snapshots that are somewhat representative of my data. But just to give you a little background on the lessons I'm going to show you, the first two snippets are from guided reading with the book City Mouse and Country Mouse. And our goals were to preview concepts in L1 and L2 using vocabulary, charts, and engaging in some instruction surrounding that, and then practicing retelling using sentence strips in both their first language and their second language. And so conceptually, the concept of city and country was difficult for students given their prior experiences, and then mostly being city kids and not having lots of experience with farms and things like that. So we spent a lot of time talking about that. And so here we're talking about, we're introducing working with the term countryside or farm. And so we talk about, we're going to explain it. I have like this vocabulary sheet used to prompt our instruction. And so I prompt the students in line 6. So the word for countryside or farmland in Somali is, and Ahmed says mel, which means like a place in Somali. And then Ms. Hassan just goes right into it and like translates for the kids and says badia. And then Ahmed goes badia, oh, and then Ms. Hassan requests information or a translation or more information, and she says badia sumatikan. And then Ahmed says, yeah, I know badia. And then Ms. Hassan is like, badia is like mesha farm kuwai. It's like the countryside is like where the farm is. It's like farm, okay. Oh yeah, that looks like farm. He's looking at the book, I think. And yeah, the next one is city. Did we talk about city? And then I say, oh, yep. But then she just goes right into translating. City is Magalo, say Magalo. And that's kind of the extent of the translation and vocabulary instruction she was engaging in at certain points, which again, you can see was not producing extended discourse or meaning making. And then we also, as I said, use Somali to build background, and so we were talking about the cities we lived in. It should also be noted that like I didn't code any of the data for times when Miss Hassan was using Somali for behavior or just kind of interpersonal things, because I was most interested in how she used it for knowledge construction, and because Miss Hassan naturally just used it for behavior and relating to the kids. And so we know that in the literature. So she said, okay, Auntie, Miss Carey lives in a city of St. Paul. There's a different city. And then she says, so there are different cities, city, Wamagalo, just translates it right there. And then you go down, she's asking the kids to remember, we read a book about a mayor. And so she explains the mayor, and then she asks for the translation. We're kind of shifting gears because we're reading about city mouse and country mouse. And so she asks about mouse matakan, do you know what it is? What's mouse in Somali? Then Hamdi goes jir, and jir is the word for mouse in Somali. And so again, just like one word translations. We're not really eliciting much out of the students. And then in this final excerpt, this is a nonfiction text about plants and animals in different seasons. And so with the nonfiction text, we were building background in the first language and the second language, and then we were explaining and practicing reading skills and strategies in the first language, the second language. So this excerpt talks about like main idea and detail, which the kids were really struggling about. And so Ms. Hassan and I, in our prior planning session, she was like, I think I just need to explain this to them in Somali, and then they'll get it. So she explains what main idea is, and then Ahmed seems to get it. Oh, it's about animals. And Mustaf adds in their different seasons, so very short responses anyways. And then Ms. Hassan goes, yeah, good job. Ms. Hassan goes on to elaborate to ask, do you understand? And then goes on to elaborate a little bit about main idea. You can get a hint from the title in the book. And then now, do you know what a detail is? I prompt her because we need to talk about what details are in the book. She goes on to explain in Somali, halhabo means one way, and then tager is to support, so supports the main idea. So again, we just don't see a lot of extended discourse from the students. And so just a brief discussion, again, I'm still working through some of this data, but we employed, and I'm including myself as a teacher because I did a lot of the teaching and the translating and engaging in this work, we employed translanguaging stances, and Ophelia Garcia and Tatiana Klein would say teachers embody both scaffolding stances and transformating stances. We did embody a scaffolding stance, which just means that we thought that using Somali would support students' learning. At times, I feel like in our conversations we embodied a transformative stance, but I'm not quite sure I saw that in the data. We also needed to build a more multilingual ecology because students weren't producing across their linguistic repertoires and find more multilingual and multicultural materials. Again, we were bound to the curriculum. And so this difficulty is not unique in literature and in multilingual settings, but it merits further research like Allard et al. That explores how translanguaging pedagogies can leave out students from less common language backgrounds. And students' resistance and these collaborative reflections indicated some linguistic hegemony and the need to be more explicit about building a multilingual ecology. And as I said, although the teachers were modeling translanguaging, we were both using Somali all the time. Me, again, at a very word level, saying a nest is a guri for birds. Guri is home. So things like that. The teachers were doing a lot of the productive sense-making and translating and translanguaging, but these translanguaging practices are actually not uncommon in comparison to the prior literature. So oftentimes, teachers will engage in label quests, so identifying and labeling vocabulary across languages. We use students' languages to build vocabulary, engage with content understanding. So these practices we were doing were not uncommon. But again, as I said, the vocabulary strategies and the translating were really carried out at this word level, which I think meant that there were limited opportunities for students to produce and receive extended discourse across their linguistic repertoire. And so, again, I'm noticing from our work and the work we've continued to do is that research really needs to elucidate effective translanguaging pedagogies for young students who are learning how to read and write across their languages for the first time and from less common language backgrounds because there is such a diversity in the students I worked with and a lack of materials. But on the teaching side, we need to provide more agentic, open-ended, meaning-making opportunities for younger learners. So if the point of translanguaging pedagogies are supposed to center the learners, that was not happening in some of these cases. And so even with a multilingual teacher, the multilingual ecology needs to be a lot more explicit. And so despite taking up these critical and asset-based language ideologies, there are several elements such as the materials, the diversity in language backgrounds, age, school structures that may limit teachers' capacity to integrate students' first languages. And so I really think we need to explore the practical practical implications for implementing translanguaging pedagogies from all language backgrounds in English medium settings. Or I think these emancipatory aims or these romanticized aims of translanguaging pedagogies are elusive. And so to kind of end on a note, like I'm not engaging in this work to see if students can translanguage, but really question like what does this mean for translanguaging pedagogies in English dominant settings. And so I think Nelson Flores puts it nicely that for me the key question is not an empirical question of what counts as translanguaging, but rather a theoretical question of how does a translanguaging perspective challenge us to think about multilingualism differently in research, policy, and in teaching. So that's what I have. So, yeah. Questions? Yeah, Dee?
So I know that you had these focal students.
Yes.
But because this was a class that had more
Yeah.
linguistic diversity, I'm just curious if the teacher was also encouraging kids
Mm-hmm.
in other groups to
Yeah.
use their home languages.
Yeah. So we did, she was across the board, probably not as intentionally. I mean, it was more intentional when I was there, but we did a lot of whole group lessons that included students' languages across the board. So we had also a student from Kenya, so we included Swahili in our vocabulary learning, we included Spanish, but it was more at this whole group level, and because of my interests in like more or less common languages, we more intentionally did it at the small group level with Somali students. Yeah.
Somewhat relatedly, I'm curious if you saw any trends of how the English-speaking students reacted to this.
Yeah.
I've seen them
Yeah.
some excitement, but was there ever times where they were like, oh my gosh, why do we have to do this? Did it create more marginalization of the Somali students?
No, I mean, they're also 7, so so it's a little bit different. I felt that it was a little bit different. They were generally like really excited to learn new words in their friends' languages, and so it just became, towards the end of the year, became kind of what we did. But we also realized we needed to be more intentional in different ways, and so once we realized we weren't, like we could have been isolating students or potentially other things were happening, we did a lot more identity-focused activities and activities that really explicitly told the students why we were including students' home languages. But I wouldn't say, at least the data didn't show me that it was isolating to students. Most were just like excited to sound out words and like, oh, and I think I told you this, but so for Ms. Hassan uses the word habria, which is like auntie in Somali, often just like as an affectionate thing. And so a lot of the like monolingual students would start using that word too, and they'd be like habria to like all the kids in the classroom. And so I feel like because multilingualism just, I guess, more implicitly was just a norm in the classroom, the kids probably didn't feel that way, but I can't speak for children, so yeah.
Were you able to see maybe just by accident if this carried over into other contexts, like other classes?
Yeah. Some teachers like stole my lesson plans. so more of our like whole group lesson plans, just because we had similar populations across languages. And again, this context was my teaching context, so I knew the teachers. So like my one of the other second grade teachers was like, hey, I see you're doing this cool activity, can I borrow it? And so they would take some of our PowerPoints.
But I mean the kids.
Oh.
Were they doing that habria thing?
Oh, I mean, they did it in the classroom. I didn't so much observe them in other contexts, but yeah. Yeah.
So my question is about the translanguaging practices, the way you coded this,
Yeah.
this transcript here. So you and Ms. Hassan
Yeah.
actually designed some activities.
Yeah.
Activities,
Yeah.
right? But you also mentioned that these translanguaging practices emerged.
Yeah.
And I know you had that continuum at the
Yeah.
one slide. So were these intentional, this translation and explaining context or concepts and all that? Or was it something that emerged?
It's something that emerged. I mean, it was probably a combination of both, because our conversations were like, okay, we're going to present this vocabulary, we're going to talk about it in both languages, but the way and this is my interpretation, the way I think Ms. Hassan took it was like, I need to translate lots of things for the students. I just need to explain a lot in Somali. And so those practices that I coded were basically what emerged, but I don't think they were not related to our conversations and our planning. Yeah, I know that's, again, I'm still working with this data. So that's a good question. Yeah.
Did you have conversations about that, like her tendency towards translation?
Yeah.
Alternative strategies for engaging students?
Yeah.
in language and practices?
We've been doing that lately and this year as we're like translating the data. And I mean, I mentioned it and tried to stimulate some of her responses in our interviews. But when we've been looking at the data, especially in the last few months and last year, realizing that the students weren't speaking, we decided we're going to change the way we do our strategies. And even just looking at, we were translating a few weeks ago, and she was like, oh my God, I'm just translating here. I'm just looking. So I think with that member checking too and getting to work with the data together has been helpful. So there have been some intentional changes in the classroom though for our study this year. So, yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious if there have been any reactions from the parents of the children who were focal students, if you've had any engagement with them, or if they've noticed anything about curiosity around language.
Yeah, so because of consent, all of the parents knew we were doing these strategies. And we had often Miss Hassan will have teachers or parents who come into the classroom and they're like, wow, you're doing all this in Somali, will you send things home? So we had some positive reactions last year. I think this year, because we were even more intentional about including families, so we had them fill out an optional like home language and culture, or we did it interview-wise with just gathering more information from the parents, just because we were also struggling with like, how do you perceive your child's language and what they know in Somali? But yeah, we've done a lot more intentional activities where the parents have come in like during conferences and have commented like, wow, you're including my students' language. And actually, a month and a half ago, when I was in the classroom, there was a parent who was not a Somali parent, but she has a multilingual child, and she was giving a tour to other parents in the school, and she said, this is one of the only classrooms I've seen where they intentionally include my child's first language. And so that was a positive thing. I mean, yes, she has like a glowing picture of it because of her student, but it was some positive feedback. But again, like this year, we've been more intentional about including the parents and letting them know kind of what we're doing. So, yeah. Thank you for coming. I went a lot faster than I thought it was going to go. But thank you for your questions. I appreciate it. So, yeah.